I want to walk you through 5 principles that I think make learning orchestration easy. So I just had to teach a workshop to over 1,000 musicians, and one of the key challenges was figuring out how do I break something as complex as orchestration down into simple concepts. Orchestration is a dense skill. You can spend years learning it, but if I had to break it down into concepts that make the beginning of your journey easy, how would I do that? And here's what I came up with. The first key is discover the sweet spots of your instruments. Every instrument has a sweet spot where it sounds most vibrant, most clear, and expressive. And writing within these ranges will make your orchestration more powerful and alive. And just like a human voice, each instrument also has registers where it can sound harsh or shrill, or it can sound too quiet to stand out. You know, if I sing, yeah, that might be my sweet spot. If I go, ah, it can sound harsh or shrill. Or if I'm singing, it's hard for me to sing loud down there. So that's the concept of a sweet spot. Now here's how you can use it. This is a cinematic song I've been producing with Kaylina Skollen. And my point is that if you want instruments to stand out and shine, you need to write in their sweet spot. For example, let's take the violin. The middle and upper ranges are where they can really sing. That kind of range is great for them singing out, being easily audible. If you reach its higher range, it's still very audible and strong, but now it starts to get shrill. If you want them just to blend in, you can put them in their lower range. You know, here for a violin, it loses presence, and actually sometimes that's a good thing because you want the violin to be just accompanying and not sticking out and really singing. Here's another example of sweet spots. I wanted my horns and trumpets to really be blazing out for this epic climax. And so I wrote in both of their sweet spots. The trumpet is an octave above the horns. And you'll notice right towards the end, the trumpets get higher and higher and they go beyond their sweet spot and they start to get shrill and really high pitched. But that was intentional because it helps them to stick out in this moment. Here they are on their own. And because it's in their sweet spot, it means that even with a whole orchestra around them, that line still sticks out. And especially at the end, those trumpets still cut through because they're so shrill and high. So understanding the sweet spots of each instrument gives your arrangement clarity and impact. When you want an instrument to shine, write in its sweet spot. When you want it to blend, then choose a range where it can play more softly. Number 2. Blend your instruments for richer textures. If you blend your instruments by having them play the same note or melody, either in unison, which means the same octave, or in separate octaves, that can create really unique and cinematic textures. It creates richer sounds. And this is one of the joys of orchestration, is that you can endlessly experiment with different combinations to achieve new colors and sounds. And it not only fills out the texture, but it adds this depth and richness without cluttering up the mix. If you combined a flute and a violin, then the flute could provide brightness and airiness, and the violin could provide warmth and richness or body. And so together they create a more layered sound. I've already shown you the horns and trumpets in octaves, but on top of that, to make the melody even stronger, I added violins in octaves again, and I added cello in octaves. Altogether, it makes for a very powerful melody. So horns plus trumpets plus both violin parts plus cellos all in octaves makes for a really rich, powerful texture, and you will definitely hear that line in the orchestration. One thing you can do for a really fat bass is double your bass line in bass trombone and tuba. And it doesn't matter which one is on the bottom, but when you put them in octaves, suddenly you get a really fat, powerful bass sound. It creates a more juggernaut sound. So blending instruments either in unison or octaves, it creates richness and depth without overloading the mix. It's a great technique for making your orchestration just sound fuller and more cinematic. The next thing is learning instrument strengths, because each instrument has its own unique strengths, and if you understand them, it allows you to make the most of your orchestration. I know for obvious ones that a flute can be fluttery and light and quick, and a cello is often associated with melodrama and emotion and heart. But I don't just mean their emotional strengths, because all instruments can be beautifully emotional. For example, think about the agility and power of each instrument. Smaller, lighter instruments like the piccolo or the flute can be used for very quick, intricate passages, while larger instruments bring more weight and gravitas and power. Just a rule of thumb. That's power from the trombones and the tuba, all larger instruments. So think about the instrument's strengths, whether it's speed, power, clarity, and that can make you create more dynamic and effective orchestrations. And the key is knowing when to let each instrument shine. The fourth principle is balancing the sound spectrum. And the reason I came up with this was because I was talking to a bunch of songwriters in this workshop. And many of them had experience with producing. You want your higher melody, you want middle bits filled out with pads or guitars, and you want your bass. And in many respects, orchestration can be the same. We have three main families in the orchestra: the woodwind, the brass, and the strings. And with each family, there are instruments that are high, instruments that are mid, and instruments that are low. And so just like balancing a song's bass, mids, treble, an orchestra is naturally structured to cover the full frequency spectrum, from low rumble, contrabass and tubas, to the high brilliance of violins and flutes. And learning where instruments fit in this spectrum allows you to create a more cinematic, balanced texture in your orchestration. So for example, violins and flutes for the highs, horns or cellos for the mids, bassoons and basses for the lows. And this means you can cover the full sonic spectrum with just an orchestra. If you listen just to my strings, they on their own have a bass range, a mid line, and a high line. If I play my brass family, you'll find the same, that there's a bass range, there are mid chords, and there's the higher melody line. And if we stick the tuba in for extra bass, so if you balance the sound spectrum, it helps your orchestration feel full and cinematic. And by learning where your instruments fit naturally, you can make sure your arrangement will cover the highs, mids, and lows in an effective way. And by the way, you don't need to be going full spectrum all the time. And this brings me on to my fifth and final point, which is about storytelling through instrumentation. Use your orchestration to enhance the story you're telling and to make the structure of your song or piece clear. The key point here is you don't want to throw the full kitchen sink in all the time. Don't go full spectrum, full orchestra all the time, because your ears will get so bored of that and tired of that so quickly. Instead, you want to keep using variety and contrast to keep your arrangement interesting. Carefully select different instruments for different sections, and that helps to build intensity, and it creates contrast, and it makes your song feel more immersive. Use your orchestration to guide your listeners through the structure or story that you're telling. I very much used it here to highlight different sections of the song. In the first section, we have this James Bondy brass as she's first waking up to her newfound confidence. But then she sings, "Whatever I have felt inside of me hasn't been able to breathe." And so we switch from that low brass to a more emotional string texture. Rather than this feeling of cycling through the same four chords again and again and again, the change in orchestration helps to pull the listeners into the story by saying, this is a new scene, this is a new verse. Varying your instrumentation helps keep your audience more hooked by providing contrast and preventing fatigue from just hearing the same sound the whole way through. So look, orchestration is a skill you can learn and develop for years. The point of this was to get you started and to give you things to think about when you explore the orchestra. The way you learn is by doing and by studying your favorite music. But I just found these principles valuable, especially the sweet spot thing. If you take one thing from this, it should be learning sweet spots, because that'll make the biggest difference to your orchestration in the long run.